You were told Islam spread by the sword, but no one told you it spread by ideas. In a world drowning in ignorance, it built libraries, universities, and a civilization obsessed with knowledge. If you don't understand this revolution of the mind, you don't understand history. Or the world you live in today, they told you Islam spread by the sword. That's the lazy version of history. That's the version that fits into a tweet, a headline, a prejudice. But history is never that simple. Civilizations are not transformed by steel alone. They are transformed by ideas. And if you look honestly, without fear, without propaganda, without inherited bias, you'll discover something uncomfortable and extraordinary. Islam did not just create a religious movement. It ignited one of the greatest intellectual revolutions in human history. Let's ground ourselves in reality. 7th century Arabia was not Rome. It was not Persia. It was not Athens. It was largely tribal, fragmented, oral. And yet within a century of the Prophet Muhammad's death, a civilization inspired by Islam was stretching from Spain to Central Asia. That expansion alone would be historically significant. But conquest is not the revolution. Conquest is common. What followed is what matters. What followed was an explosion of scholarship, translation, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, and law. That is not the footprint of a civilization obsessed with destruction. That is the signature of a civilization obsessed with knowledge. The first word revealed in the Quran was read. Think about that. Not fight, not conquer, not obey. Read. In a largely illiterate society, the foundation was literacy. That is revolutionary. Because when you elevate knowledge to a sacred act, you change the trajectory of a people. Learning becomes worship. Inquiry becomes devotion. Curiosity becomes a moral duty. And once that mindset takes hold, institutions follow. In Baghdad, the Abbasid caliphs established the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Scholars from different backgrounds, religions, and languages gathered to translate Greek philosophy, Persian literature, Indian mathematics. This was not narrow-minded dogmatism. This was intellectual hunger. Works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Euclid, texts that might have been lost, were translated into Arabic, studied, critiqued, expanded upon. Let's be honest about something else. Europe at that time was not leading the intellectual world. The so-called Dark Ages were real in terms of institutional collapse in parts of Western Europe. Meanwhile, in cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and Damascus, there were libraries with hundreds of thousands of volumes. Cordoba had streetlights when London did not. Hospitals in the Muslim world had structured wards, medical licensing, and clinical observation. This is not romanticism. This is documented history. But the revolution was deeper than infrastructure. It was conceptual. Islam created a worldview where the universe was orderly, rational, and created by a single God. That matters. Because if the universe is rational, then it can be studied. If it operates by laws, those laws can be discovered. Scientific inquiry thrives in a cosmos that makes sense. This theological foundation created intellectual confidence. Studying nature was not rebellion against God, it was a way to understand His creation. Consider mathematics. The very word algebra comes from the Arabic al-Jabr, from the work of al-Khwarizmi. The concept of algorithms, foundational to modern computing, derives from the Latinized form of his name. Think about that the next time you use your smartphone. The numerical system we use today, often called Arabic numerals, was transmitted and developed through Islamic scholarship. Without these intellectual bridges, the Renaissance in Europe would have been delayed, perhaps radically altered. Medicine? Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, a text that became a standard medical reference in European universities for centuries. That's not a footnote. That's foundational. In philosophy, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, reintroduced Aristotle to Europe. His commentaries influenced thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. The conversation between faith and reason that shaped Western philosophy was, in part, mediated through Islamic intellectual work. Now pause. This is not about superiority. It's about accuracy. Civilizations rise and fall. Contributions overlap. Knowledge is cumulative. But to erase this intellectual revolution is not just unfair, it is intellectually dishonest. And dishonesty about history breeds confusion about the present. What made this revolution possible? It wasn't genetics. It wasn't geography alone. It was a value system. Islam placed immense emphasis on justice, law, scholarship, and community responsibility. The ulama, the scholars, held moral authority. Memorization, debate, legal reasoning, these became cultural norms. The mosque was not only a place of prayer, it was a place of learning. The madrasa institutionalized education long before many European universities emerged. And here's something even more radical. Scholars in the Islamic world often disagreed openly. Schools of law developed with different methodologies. Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali. Theological debates flourished between Ash'arites, Mutazilites, and others. This was not intellectual stagnation. This was intellectual dynamism. There were tensions, yes. There were political struggles, but there was also rigorous argumentation, preservation of texts, refinement of ideas. So why does this matter now? Because narratives shape identity. And if you grow up hearing that Islam is inherently anti-intellectual, anti-science, anti-progress, you absorb a lie. And lies distort policy, prejudice, and perception. Understanding this intellectual revolution forces you to confront complexity. It forces you to see that civilizations are not caricatures. At the same time, this history poses a challenge to Muslim societies today. If your ancestors built observatories, hospitals, libraries, if they pioneered optics, chemistry, and historiography, then intellectual complacency is a betrayal of your own tradition. The Golden Age was not magic. It was the result of valuing knowledge, funding scholarship, tolerating debate, and engaging the wider world. Let's talk about transmission. The Islamic world did not hoard knowledge. Through Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, through Sicily, through trade routes and translation centers, knowledge flowed into Europe. When European scholars began rediscovering Aristotle and other classical works, many of those texts had survived because Muslim scholars preserved and expanded them. The Renaissance did not emerge in a vacuum. It had intellectual ancestors. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Civilizations borrow from each other constantly. The West owes debts to the Islamic world. The Islamic world inherited and transformed Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. China, India, Africa, all have interwoven intellectual histories. The idea of pure, isolated genius civilizations is a myth. The real story of humanity is collaboration, adaptation, translation. But revolutions do not last forever. Political fragmentation, invasions like the Mongol sack of Baghdad, internal rigidity, economic shifts, many factors contributed to decline. The point is not to romanticize. The point is to recognize that what was built was real. It changed global intellectual history. When you study the Quran, you find repeated invitations to reflect, to ponder, to use reason. Do you not think? Do you not reflect? This rhetorical pattern cultivates a mindset. It tells believers that faith is not blind conformity. It is conscious engagement. Of course, practice has varied across time and place, but the textual foundation for inquiry is there. And that foundation produced polymaths, scholars who were theologians and scientists, jurists and physicians. Knowledge was not compartmentalized the way it often is today. It was holistic. Ethics and empiricism coexisted. Law and logic intersected. There was an ambition to understand the world in totality. Now imagine the psychological effect of that. If you are part of a civilization that sees learning as sacred, that funds scholars, that debates ideas in public forums, you generate momentum. You create intellectual ecosystems. Students travel across regions to study with masters. Isnods, chains of transmission, ensure accountability and scholarship. There is structure, rigor, continuity. Contrast that with a narrative that reduces Islam to violence or oppression. That narrative collapses centuries of intellectual vibrancy into a stereotype. It makes it easier to dismiss, to fear, to marginalize. But reality is more demanding. Reality requires nuance. And nuance is not weakness, it is strength. Because when you acknowledge the intellectual revolution sparked by Islam, you also acknowledge the shared heritage of humanity. You begin to see that modern science, global trade, legal systems, and universities are products of layered histories. This conversation is not about defending everything done in the name of Islam. No civilization is morally flawless. Power corrupts everywhere. The point is that the early centuries of Islamic civilization demonstrate what happens when a society fuses spiritual conviction with intellectual ambition. The tragedy would be to treat that history as nostalgia instead of inspiration. The revolution was not just about translating texts. It was about cultivating minds. It was about building institutions. It was about believing that truth is worth seeking, even if it requires grappling with Greek metaphysics or Indian numerals. So when someone tells you Islam has nothing to do with intellectual progress, you now know better. When someone suggests faith and reason are inherently enemies in Islamic history, you can challenge that with evidence. And when you encounter simplistic narratives, positive or negative, you can resist them. The deeper lesson is this: ideas matter. A single word, read, helped catalyze a civilization that changed mathematics, medicine, philosophy, architecture, and governance. That is the power of worldview. That is the power of belief aligned with curiosity. If we are serious about building a future of coexistence and innovation, we must tell history truthfully. Not selectively, not polemically, truthfully. Because honest history builds mutual respect, and mutual respect builds cooperation. Islam sparked one of the greatest intellectual revolutions in history, not because it was perfect, but because it ignited a culture that valued knowledge as sacred. It transformed tribes into scholars, deserts into centers of learning, revelation into research. And its echoes are still with us in our numbers, our hospitals, our universities, our philosophical debates. The question now is not whether that revolution happened. It did. The question is whether we have the courage to acknowledge it and the wisdom to learn from it. Because once you begin to study this seriously, you realize something even more disruptive. The intellectual revolution sparked by Islam was not accidental. It was systemic. It was embedded in law, culture, economics, and spirituality. Take the institution of waqf, charitable endowments. Wealthy individuals would dedicate property or funds to support schools, hospitals, libraries, water systems. This created a decentralized funding model for knowledge and public welfare. Education was not dependent solely on the whims of rulers. It had civil society support. That structure matters. Intellectual revolutions are sustained by institutions, not just inspiration. Look at urban design. Cities like Baghdad were deliberately constructed as centers of administration and scholarship. Markets thrived alongside mosques. Scholars debated legal rulings in public. Booksellers were respected figures. Paper manufacturing, adopted and expanded after contact with China, made books more accessible. When paper becomes affordable, ideas multiply. When ideas multiply, intellectual energy accelerates. And then there is the culture of travel for knowledge. Students crossed deserts and seas to study with renowned teachers. Knowledge was not hoarded locally. It was pursued globally. This mobility created networks, intellectual supply chains stretching from West Africa to Central Asia. When a Hadith scholar in Bukhara corresponded with a jurist in Cairo, they were participating in an early globalized knowledge economy. Now think about what that does psychologically. It creates ambition. It tells a young mind that learning is a path to dignity. In many Islamic societies, scholars could critique rulers. That doesn't mean there was no repression, but it does mean that moral authority did not belong exclusively to political power. The scholar had legitimacy rooted in mastery of knowledge. That dynamic can restrain tyranny and elevate discourse. Let's also dismantle another myth, that Islamic intellectual history was purely religious. It wasn't. Yes, theology and law were central, but astronomy was essential for determining prayer times and navigation. Mathematics was needed for inheritance laws and trade. Medicine addressed real human suffering. Optics, developed by figures like Ibn al-Haytham, transformed understanding of vision and light through experimental methods. He insisted on observation and testing hypotheses. That methodological rigor is foundational to modern science. This is critical. The revolution was not just about absorbing Greek thought. It was about critiquing and surpassing it. Scholars didn't translate Aristotle and stop there. They argued with him. They refined logic. They expanded metaphysics. They integrated revelation with reason in ways that were original and sophisticated. And the revolution was multilingual. Arabic became a lingua franca of scholarship, but Persian, Turkish, and other languages flourished. Jewish and Christian scholars worked within Islamic lands, contributing to philosophy and medicine. This was not an isolated monoculture, it was an ecosystem. Diversity, when structured under shared legal and civic frameworks, can become productive rather than chaotic. Now ask yourself, why don't we talk about this more? Because history is often weaponized. Colonial narratives downplayed Islamic contributions to justify domination. Modern political conflicts distort perceptions further. But truth does not disappear because it is inconvenient. It waits. And waiting truth has consequences. When young Muslims grow up disconnected from this intellectual heritage, they may internalize either inferiority or reactionary pride. Both unhealthy. Inferiority says, we contributed nothing. Reactionary pride says, we were once great, therefore we need not change. Both miss the point. The real lesson is dynamic. Greatness came from openness, discipline, curiosity, and institutional strength. You cannot replicate the golden age by nostalgia. You replicate it by reviving its principles, respect for scholarship, investment in education, tolerance for debate, integration of ethics and inquiry. Those are not medieval values. They are timeless. And for non-Muslims, acknowledging this revolution dismantles simplistic binaries. It challenges the idea that civilization is a zero-sum competition between East and West. The categories themselves are historically fluid. Baghdad was once the intellectual center of the world. Cordoba was a beacon of learning. Power shifts. Knowledge flows. Here is another uncomfortable reality. Many foundational concepts in global civilization passed through Islamic hands before reaching Europe. That includes navigational tools that facilitated exploration, medical practices that improved public health, philosophical frameworks that shaped scholasticism. To deny this is to amputate part of our shared human story. But intellectual revolutions are fragile. They require continuous renewal. When debate narrows, when dogmatism replaces inquiry, when political instability disrupts institutions, decline follows. This is not unique to Islamic civilization. It is universal. Rome declined. China experienced cycles of innovation and stagnation. Europe endured intellectual suppression before rebounding. So the story of Islam's intellectual revolution is not a fairy tale. It is a case study. It demonstrates how worldview, institutions, and cultural values interact to produce extraordinary outcomes. It also demonstrates how those outcomes can erode. And that brings us to the present moment. We live in an era of information overload but intellectual shallowness. We have access to more data than any civilization before us, yet we struggle with polarization and misinformation. Studying how earlier civilizations structured knowledge, how they verified chains of transmission, debated respectfully, funded scholarship, might offer lessons. The Isnad system in Hadith scholarship required tracing every narration back through reliable transmitters. Scholars scrutinized biographies, memory reliability, moral character. That's a sophisticated epistemology. In a world of viral rumors and algorithm-driven outrage, the idea of disciplined verification feels revolutionary again. Likewise, the integration of ethics with knowledge challenges modern compartmentalization. Today, technological innovation often outpaces moral reflection. But in classical Islamic scholarship, law, theology, and philosophy intersected constantly with practical life. Knowledge was not neutral, it carried responsibility. Imagine reviving that mindset globally, not as imitation, but as inspiration. A world where learning is sacred, where disagreement is structured and principled, where institutions protect inquiry rather than suppress it. That is the deeper significance of this revolution. And let's confront another distortion. Some assume that faith necessarily constrains science. Yet historically, Islamic scholars saw no contradiction in studying the stars while believing in divine creation. They believed the universe had coherence because it was created by a rational God. That metaphysical confidence empowered exploration. Of course, tension existed. No civilization is free from conflict between orthodoxy and innovation. But the dominant narrative of early Islamic centuries is not anti-intellectualism, it is synthesis. Revelation and reason were not enemies, they were partners in understanding reality. This intellectual revolution also influenced art and architecture. Geometric patterns in Islamic design reflect mathematical sophistication. Calligraphy elevated language into visual beauty. Architecture fused engineering with spirituality. Mosques that embodied symmetry and acoustics, reflecting both aesthetic and scientific mastery. Trade networks further amplified intellectual exchange. Muslim merchants connected Africa, Europe, and Asia. With trade came ideas, technologies, crops, and cultural practices. Economic vitality supports intellectual vitality. Prosperity funds libraries. Stability attracts scholars. But here's the critical pivot. Revolutions are not permanent states. They are processes. They require humility, the willingness to learn from others. The early Islamic world absorbed knowledge from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. It did not fear foreign ideas. It engaged them. Sometimes it rejected them. Often it transformed them. That openness is perhaps the most revolutionary trait of all. Because insecurity breeds isolation. Confidence breeds curiosity. The Islamic intellectual revolution was powered by confidence. Confidence rooted in faith and in a sense of civilizational mission. And today, confidence must be rebuilt not through slogans, but through substance. Through schools that prioritize critical thinking. Through funding research. Through cultivating scholars who are both ethically grounded and intellectually fearless. When you understand this history, you stop seeing civilizations as static identities. You see them as dynamic systems. Islam in its early centuries was a catalyst, a force that reorganized societies around knowledge. It changed legal structures, educational norms, and intellectual priorities. The revolution was not confined to elites. Literacy spread. Markets thrived on contracts and legal clarity. Scientific tools improved agriculture and navigation. Knowledge had practical impact. It improved daily life. And perhaps that is the ultimate measure of an intellectual revolution. Does it elevate humanity? In many measurable ways, the early Islamic world did. It preserved knowledge during turbulent times. It expanded scientific horizons. It institutionalized education. The challenge now is to resist reductionism. Not to replace one myth with another, but to hold complexity. Islam sparked one of the greatest intellectual revolutions in history. That statement is not propaganda. It is supported by evidence across disciplines. But the revolution spirit is not a museum artifact. It is a living possibility. And whether that possibility is realized depends on whether we value truth over narrative, substance over stereotype, curiosity over complacency. So here's the truth you cannot ignore. Islam did not just enter history as a religion. It entered history as a force that reorganized how human beings thought, learned, debated, calculated, healed, and governed. It transformed scattered tribes into a civilization that built libraries when others were burning, that calculated the stars when others feared them, that preserved knowledge when the world was fragmenting. That is not mythology. That is intellectual fact. And the message is not about pride. It is about responsibility. If a single word, read, could ignite centuries of scholarship, what excuse do we have today in an age of unlimited access to information? If faith once empowered inquiry instead of suppressing it, then any culture that divorces belief from curiosity has misunderstood its own foundations. This is bigger than Islam. It is about what happens when a society treats knowledge as sacred, when ideas are pursued with discipline, when institutions are built to protect learning. That is how civilizations rise. And when those values decay, civilizations decline. So do not reduce history to slogans. Do not accept caricatures. Understand the revolution, because when you understand it, you see that the real power was never the sword, it was the mind. And the moment we choose ignorance over inquiry, we betray not just one civilization's legacy, but humanity's greatest strength.